Hello, everyone. I think we have a few folks joining us. You'll find when you join the webinar tonight, if you've already signed on, that we have a poll to kick off the evening's discussion. And that is a simple question. Have you visited the Sargent murals in person? So let's take a minute to fill out that poll if you can, or if you can access it on your screen. I apologize to those of you who are calling in, and we'll get started in just a minute. I should mention that throughout this talk, if you have any trouble seeing the slides jump ahead or hearing me, please do get in touch using the chat feature at the bottom of the webinar application. I think we're just about ready to start. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the first entry in the Sargent Lecture Series at Boston Public Library. This is our second attempt to launch the series, originally scheduled for March 2020, which was poor timing in retrospect, but we're so glad to be here now and to have had ample time to get familiar with this virtual format, which allows us to include speakers and audience members near and far. My name is Meghan Weeks, and I am the Curator of Interpretation at BPL in our Special Collections Department. It is a privilege to serve as one of the many stewards of our historic Central Library building in Copley Square, and I'm particularly honored to be able to work with the mural cycle on which John Singer Sargent spent some 3 decades of his storied artistic output. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. I've already mentioned the poll, which we would ask you to fill out if you're able. And my wonderful colleagues, particularly Amanda this evening on our AV team, are standing by to take any comments or questions that you might have throughout this talk. I'll be glad to answer as many as possible towards the end. This session will also be recorded and made available to audiences who aren't able to join us in real time this evening. I am honored to be joined by a cohort of major contributors to Sargent's BPL murals, whose lectures are listed here. All of the information and links to register for these lectures, these free online events, is available at bpl.org/Sargent. Together, we hope to inspire future visitors and further questions about this mural cycle. Why has Sargent and his work remained relevant? How do we interpret his work through a 2022 lens? And what more can we add to the conversation? Tonight's talk will serve as an introduction to Sargent's extraordinary Triumph of Religion mural cycle at the Central Library in Copley Square, on which he worked between 1890 and 1919. I hope to accomplish a few things in this hour. 1, to give you all an orientation to the murals and to their context in Sargent's life. As part of this tour of sorts, I will try to note the conservators, scholars, and authors who have worked with this remarkable mural cycle, many of whom are participating in this series. We're grateful to them. 2, I hope to provide some fresh insights into the visual study of these paintings. I will argue that this is not some century-old mural cycle faded away, but a work that was both contemporary in Sargent's life and one that remains relevant and open to further investigation today. I hope to draw your attention to the resources here at BPL that connect to the murals, and to make links to other institutions that make up a larger infrastructure of information that help us to tell the story of Triumph. There are supporting resources all around, but the real murals are here. Our aim is to reestablish Boston Public Library as a central site for the study of John Singer Sargent, and to make you feel welcome to engage with this remarkable body of work, free to all. So first, we should probably orient you to the Central Library building. Sargent's murals are located on the 3rd floor of the McKim building, one of 2 structures that make up our Central Library in Copley Square. BPL is proud to be the nation's oldest urban public library, first opening its doors in a much smaller location in 1854. The building, constructed between 1888 and 1895, is named for its architect, Charles Follen McKim, shown here at center, flanked by partners William Rutherford Mead and Stanford White. Pictured here is a photograph from the library cornerstone laying ceremony in November 1888, during which a poem by Oliver Wendell Holmes declared, quote, "This palace is the people's own." This idea of creating a palace for the people inform many of the design decisions for the library. Not only would this building provide ample space for BPL's growing collections and Boston's exploding population, but also include the best materials available and bring in preeminent sculptors, painters, and craftspeople to complement the architectural vision of McKim. An article during the construction in the Liverpool Mercury across the Atlantic called the library, quote, one of the most interesting art movements in the world, unquote. Here are just a few highlights. Marble seals on the facade by famed sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. In the vestibule, through which patrons enter the building off of Copley Square, there are 6 bronze doors by Daniel Chester French. 2 pairs of doors are pictured here. In the lobby, a vaulted mosaic-clad ceiling by skilled Italian immigrants living in Boston's North End. A grand staircase composed out of yellow sienna marble, bringing us to the heart of the building. 2 stately memorial lions, and with apologies to our friends in New York, these are the OG American Public Library lions. The only murals by renowned French artist Pierre Puvis-de-Chavannes outside of Europe. A sumptuous book delivery room adorned with Edwin Austin Abbey's Quest of the Holy Grail murals. A 50-foot-high, barrel-vaulted grand reading room with carved oak tables. Bates Hall, the most Instagrammed reading room in all the land. With the design and construction of this building, the City of Boston and library leaders committed to giving their public a space that would inspire them, a space in which they could learn and advance themselves, free to all. These 3 words are literally carved upon the facade of the building and remain true to our mission today. On the 3rd floor, accessible by a lift or this long and somewhat intimidating flight of stairs, is Sargent Hall, where Sargent adorned a vaulted space that led to the special collections rooms. Before we head up there, let's consider how this commission came about. It all started with a dinner. At this dinner, both Abby and Sargent gathered with Augustus St. Gaudens, along with 3 architectural partners, McKim, Mead, and White, at the Players Club in New York in May of 1890. The Players Club is pictured here to the right. At this dinner, both Abby and Sargent were invited to adorn the library with mural paintings in dedicated rooms, Abby on the 2nd floor and Sargent on the 3rd. Mural painting would be a new challenge to both artists. The 2 expat painters and friends would share a large studio in Gloucestershire, England, while they worked on the early stages of their library murals. While there are unfortunately few images of Sargent at work on his panels, this one shows Abby at work in his studio at Morgan Hall. The murals were painted on Belgian linen canvas abroad in England, remote work, if you will, and shipped to Boston for installation. The prospect of decorating the city's new public library building with murals was an exciting one for Sargent. Although he was born in Florence, Italy, to American parents in 1856, studied in Europe, and made his most permanent residence in London, he had strong ties to Boston through his family and friends, including Isabella Stewart Gardner. While Sargent didn't travel to the States until his early 20s, he would later write in correspondence that he was homesick for Boston. This city meant much to him. By the late 1880s, Sargent had established himself as a premier portrait artist, attracting droves of sitters and a steady stream of income from some 600 portraits in total. Sargent's 1927 biography by Evan Charteris includes this satirical sketch shown to the left by Max Beerbohm. And I apologize as the lecture or the polls just came up in my window here. Looks like, wow, about 3/4 of you guys have visited the murals previously. For those 30 or so that haven't yet, we hope you'll be able to come and visit us here soon. I say, no matter how often I use Zoom, there's still a lot to keep track of. So, as I mentioned, we have this wonderful, if not funny, satirical sketch by Max Beerbohm showing John Singer Sargent's London studio at 31 Tite Street. The drawing shows women and their valets queuing up to be painted by the most desired portrait artist of the day, while he looks on, or perhaps hides, as one would, through his window. There was such a demand for Sargent to render the likenesses of British and American society that it's remarkable the poor man was able to eat, sleep, or paint anything but portraits. Now, Amanda, if you don't mind, Amanda's going to cue up a little video here so we can get an overview of the triumph of religion. Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. We'll give you a brief overview before we head up and look at things in more detail. This mural project also allowed Sargent to try his hand at what was considered the highest form of public art. Well, the highest form of art, I should say, public art. The scale of this mural project provided Sargent with an escape from the very form of art that had made him both famous and in demand, portraits. Sargent decided on a grand theme, triumph of religion, which would allow him to explore some of the visually compelling subjects that he had learned through study. Now we're reaching the top of this long sandstone staircase. His early biographer, Edwin Charteris, suggested that he was treating his mural subjects, quote, objectively and dispassionately, unquote. As Sargent had said of his portrait painting, quote, I do not judge, I only chronicle. The vaulted third floor space in a special library's floor measures 84 feet long, 23 feet wide, and 26 feet high. It is lit by skylights which illuminate the murals. Sargent installed this project in 4 separate phases, working with a team to affix the canvas to the plaster walls using a strong paste of lead white and linseed oil, a technique called mariflage. We just took a spin through the north end of the gallery, which was installed in 1895, and are now approaching the south. In 1903, he approached this end of the hall. Here, a large half-moon shaped lunette, the dogma of the redemption above, and a frieze of angels below. 1916, the third cycle, or third installation, I should say, was a productive one. It includes this gilded arch, the mysteries of the rosary, and 2 supporting images of Madonna. In addition, 6 smaller lunettes, 3 on the west wall, heaven at left, judgment at center, and hell at right. There are also 3 lunettes along the east wall, Armageddon, shown here at left, Israel and the Law at center, and the Messianic era at right. At lower right, we see his final installation of 1919. This an image of church, and at far left, an image of synagogue. The synagogue panel would become particularly contentious, as we'll see later in the talk this evening, and I should say later in the series. The blank panel at center remains blank to this day. Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm going to share my screen again, jump right back into the PowerPoint. We're back. Let's circle back to the contract, copies of which are in BPL's Trustees Art and Architecture records in our Archives department, among other correspondence. The first contract, signed in 1893, called for Sargent to decorate the north and south ends of the hall, a total cost of $15,000 to be paid to the artist by the city. The second, signed in 1895, allowed him to expand his commission to the long west and east walls, linking the 2 ends. This was for an additional $15,000, paid for by a subscription fund of private individuals. Throughout the project, Sargent worked with a range of painting styles and experimented with various forms of raised relief, 3-dimensional materials affixed to the painted surface to help illuminate these figures. The painter found himself working in sculpture, throwing new energy and experimentation into this major project, and perhaps, as we mentioned, to prove a new range of his abilities. Sargent also had a major hand in the design of the surrounding ornament, including medallions on the ceiling, wall sconces, and the very architecture of this room. Some of his correspondence with McKim indicates his plans for the cornices, as shown here. Fortunately, Sargent had help in this major architectural undertaking by architect Thomas A. Fox. Sargent worked with Fox on the design and installation of these, as well as his later murals at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. The Boston Athenaeum holds Fox's correspondence with the artist in their archives collection, an invaluable resource in providing insight into Sargent's process. These murals also shed light on the relationship between Sargent and Fox. Their language is not only work-oriented, but that amongst friends. For instance, they frequently sign off to each other by saying, "Get your hair cut." I'm guessing this was an inside joke. Let's take a closer look at Sargent's first installation in 1895, unveiled in the north end of Sargent Hall, the same year as the building's opening. The lower portion of these murals, about 10 feet off of the ground, depicts the frieze of prophets, with Moses at center, holding 2 tablets bearing the 10 Commandments. Those familiar with Sargent's portraits might observe that these figures are in the artist's wheelhouse. Their facial features capture the likenesses of real people who modeled for these prophets. Their garments are rendered with Sargent's trademark loose yet methodical strokes. The names of the prophets are written in Hebrew above. Sargent had initially scribed these in English, but they were later changed by the artist, likely with the help of a local scholar of Judaism. Sargent's correspondence with Fox at the Athenaeum includes sketches detailing Sargent's attention to detail when it came to determining the depth of the molding and how it would affect patrons' ability to see the figures. Such is the case in his rendering of Moses in high relief, standing out on the central pediment. Above the frieze of prophets is a large half-moon-shaped lunette. At lower center, a group of Israelites are oppressed by the Egyptian pharaoh at left and the Assyrian king at right. Here, we find the artist referencing the visual styles or vernaculars of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, as he had come to know them through study and travel. After Sargent verbally accepted the commission in 1890, he ventured to North Africa and the Middle East with his 2 sisters and mother to source reference material for the library murals. It must have been freeing, getting away from portraits with the objective of such a large project that encouraged travel and discovery. Speaking of discoveries, we owe much to the work of a curator in the Victoria and Albert Museum, Ella Ravelet, for discovering a cache of over 600 photographs once belonging to Sargent. These had been previously scattered across departments in the museum in London. From this incredible collection, we can identify some of Sargent's visual references in his mural work, including this view at right, or I should say at left, of a carving of hieroglyphics, a potential inspiration for his Egyptian figures, as well as several photographs of Assyrian friezes that correspond to his subjects in the 1895 lunette. Further credit is due to scholar Chloe Sharp, who conducted extensive work on the connections between these reference photographs and Sargent's Spanish sculpture-inspired imagery for his second BPL installation. Chloe's lecture on May 18th, introduced by Richard Ormond, will be one not to miss. The broad arch above this north end, and please forgive my haphazard highlighting here, features the subject of the pagan gods. It is an incredibly complex intertwining of pagan figures and materials, shown flattened to a plane here. At right, we have Astarte, the blue-robed goddess standing atop a crescent moon. Her jewels, rendered in metal and colored glass relief. Her veil conceals figures pushing outwards towards the edge of the frame. Zooming in on this image reveals drip marks in the light cerulean blue paint, suggesting not only how thin the washes of paint were, perhaps distilled with mineral spirits or turpentine, but also that Sargent was painting her right side up. This photograph from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston's Sargent archive depicts Sargent at work on the Pagan Gods Arch in his London studio. Above Astarte's head is a small orange orb held by the hands of a scarab beetle. Behind this is a dark face with 2 narrow eyes, the face of the pagan goddess Neith, the goddess of the heavens. Her body, more highlighting here, spans the entire arch. Her breastplate is the gilded signs of the zodiac at center or at the height of the arch, Her hands touch the eastern horizon, and her torso extends to the west, behind the dead pharaoh laid out on a plinth. For any yoga fans out there, Neith is essentially in downward dog position, forming the arc of the heavens above us. Moloch, the bull-headed god, supports the left side of this panel. His crown of the sun sits at the zenith of the arch, and its rays extend downward to the earth, touching the surface of our planet with gold gilded hands. Each one of these was removed and individually cleaned during the most recent treatment by Harvard Strauss Center for Conservation. There are a number of preparatory oil sketches for this pagan god's arch in particular. 2 are in BPL's collection, shown here. Others are at the Harvard Art Museums. Still another is on display at the Gardner Museum in the Blue Room. Out of context, these wildly imaginative studies, and even the panels themselves, might seem confusing. When the disembodied ceiling portion and lunette were first shown at the 126th Royal Academy exhibition in London, many viewers marveled at their complexity and tried to picture their place in the library. One reviewer erroneously wrote that this would be a section for the roof in Bates Hall, the main reading room, which does add a new layer of thinking to how that may have changed our room today. Another thought that in whatever location, some of Sargent's followers might be, quote, stunned and hopeless by the spectacle. Most would not see the panels in their final location, some 3,000 miles away. Context is key. Moving on to the second installation. Sargent's second installation followed 8 years later in 1903. Here, he tackled the south wall of the hall, often called the Christian end. At the base of this section is the frieze of angels, mirroring the frieze of prophets in the north end. The style of these angels is notably different from that of the prophets. These are more icons than real people, and Sargent is working in a palette of primary reds, blues, and golds. The large lunette above, the Dogma of the Redemption, features 3 figures representing the Holy Trinity, wearing a single red robe. Its fringe bears raised relief, repeating the Latin word sanctus, or holy. At center is a large sculptural crucifix with Christ on the cross. He is flanked by the figures Adam at left and Eve at right. At the base of this cross is a feathered pelican, placed here because pelicans were a bird associated with sacrifice in the crucifixion. The practice of these creatures plucking their own skin to draw blood and provide food for their young was known as pelican vulning, from the Latin word vulnero, to harm or wound. Shown here is an illustration from a medieval manuscript in the Getty collection on a post on the very subject of pelican vulning. This is an example of the sort of imagery that Sargent may have consulted to bring this symbol into his own crucifixion scene. The third round of installations in 1916, as we mentioned earlier, was a particularly productive one for Sargent, but it was also a point in the project during which the library president and trustees started applying pressure for what was becoming a decades-long commission, far exceeding the bounds of the contract. Most of us can relate to projects that become longer and more drawn out than initially intended. I know I can. Sargent's correspondence with the library in the early 19-teens suggests that he was coming to terms with the magnitude of this project, and that the library, and particularly the accounting team, was growing impatient. On April 15th of 1914, President of the Library Trustees, Josiah Benton, writes a follow-up letter to Sargent after receiving, quote, no acknowledgement or answer, unquote, to a query that previous autumn. Quote, our attention is called to this matter by the auditing department, who write us asking, is there no way that this contract can be closed up, unquote. And then Benton finishes with a somewhat biting comment, quote, it seems hardly necessary to remind you that the contract was by the terms to be completed in 1897, i.e. 17 years earlier. 2 weeks later, Sargent responds, expressing his remorse for a, quote, unjustifiable delay. Quote, the slowness with which my work for the Boston Library has progressed, he insists, is largely due to having not anticipated how involved the relief modeling would be. Quote, in spite, he says, of my having devoted practically all my time to it for the last many years. unquote. A month later, President Benton took the matter into his own hands, booking a sailing to London to see the progress for himself. In late 1914, the tone turned to one out of concern with the onset of World War I. Benton writing to Sargent that while he didn't mind him taking more time, he and the trustees were, quote, afraid something might happen that will prevent us from you having completed work in the library, unquote. By 1915, they were, quote, very anxious that his paintings should be got out of London as soon as possible. Finally, by early 1916, Sargent was negotiating the shipping of the panels at a time when transatlantic freight and passenger travel seemed increasingly risky. That spring, the panels and the artists safely arrived. We are honored to be joined by accomplished art historian and author Molly Crawford Volk, who will be speaking on this much anticipated phase of the project in particular. In this 1916 installation, Sargent completed the south end of the gallery. This included his gilded ceiling showing 15 Mysteries of the Rosary and 2 images of Madonna, Madonna and Child, shown here at left, and Madonna of Sorrows with her 7 swords representing 7 sorrows, shown here at right. In this productive year, in which Sargent rented a studio at the Pope Building on Columbus Avenue and also began work on a mural project for the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, he installed 6 more lunettes. On the west wall, Judgment at center, was St. Peter weighing the souls who had approached the gates of heaven. At left of this wall, Heaven, with heraldic figures ascending into the celestial blue. At right, Hell, the alternative, personified as a muscular green monster with its fangs clasping down on those who didn't pass the test. I'm sure there's a green monster joke here to be made for you Red Sox fans and Yankees fans, but I'll hold off for now. Moving along to the east wall, Armageddon, or the fall of Gog and Magog, installed at left. At center, Israel and the Law. At right, the Messianic era, or the Golden Era. BPL holds 2 studies for the 1916 Gog and Magog panel and canvas, pictured here at left, and 2 studies for the Madonna panels on wooden boards, pictured here at right. These boards were part of a 1/3 scale model of the hall that Sargent used in London to experiment with the placement of panels and their relief elements. Catherine Olivier has written a fascinating article on Sargent's use of the model. Unfortunately, much of the model, which had found its way to Harvard, was dismantled and discarded in 1942. Although some surviving portions, including 2 now at the BPL, were sent to the Fitchburg Art Museum. In BPL's Boylston Room on the 2nd floor of the McKim Building hangs a painting by Frank O. Salisbury entitled Memory Impression of Mr. J.S.S.'s Studio, 1915. This painting depicts Salisbury's recollection of the state of that very studio, with Sargent shown at right, casting the light of a lamp on various panels within his cycle. To the upper right of this painting, or I should say the upper left of this painting, presumably hanging on a background wall, is a panel that we recognize as Heaven, later installed in 1916. The 1919 installation would be Sargent's last in his BPL project. Here, he installed framed allegories of Synagogue at left and church at right. It is believed that a major factor in Sargent failing to complete the final panel was an explosive controversy that emerged around his depiction of Synagogue in the 1919 installation. The decision to depict religious subjects in a public secular building is likely not one that would be made in this century. And yet, with the exception of some helpful corrections and feedback made to Sargent by those in the local religious community, there was no notable public criticism issued against the murals until the unveiling of the Synagogue panel, shown here at left. In short, patrons within and beyond the Jewish community took issue with the depiction of Synagogue as a blindfolded, collapsing figure, gathering the falling tapestries of her temple around her. Also notable was the contrast of the figure of church, a comparatively stable figure. Many wondered, was Sargent somehow implying that Judaism was falling and Christianity rising or superior? Despite Sargent denying any ill will in these panels, patrons continued to be outraged by this panel, standing in a secular government institution, let alone in one so trusted as their public library. The fervor reached such an amplitude that a House bill in the Massachusetts State Legislature in May 2022, I apologize, May 1922, exactly a century ago, called for the panel to be taken down and put under the control of the Education Department. Over the course of 2 years, the legislation fizzled, but the outrage did not, at least not before an unknown patron splashed a vial of ink across the panel in 1924, vandalizing it. One can understand why Sargent, who recoiled from controversy, may have lagged on this project amidst this flurry of news and attention. Sally Promy, director of the Yale Initiative for the Study of Material and Visual Cultures of Religion, has written extensively about the murals and this controversy in her 1999 book, Painting Religion in Public. You can take it out from the Boston Public Library. It's a must read for anyone looking to take a deeper dive into this project. A panel discussion coming up soon featuring Elena Hoffenberg, who has lectured on the synagogue controversy, and Rabbi Bernard Melman from Temple Israel will reinterpret this controversy and its implications for the Jewish community then and now. This panel will also investigate what our role as an institution is, stewarding historically harmful public art. We want to bring this controversy to light and start, hopefully, further conversation. Two of our speakers on May 23rd, Karen Corsano and Dan Williman, have written a book on the memorialization of Sargent's late niece, who perished in a bombing in Paris the year prior, and the connections between these two 1919 panels in World War I. I will leave this explanation to them, but suffice to say that Sargent was undeniably distracted in a time of great personal loss and living through a world war, and for that matter, an all too relatable pandemic. Sargent actually survived the 1918 Spanish flu. Sargent was also consumed with the mural commissions that had evolved from his work at BPL. The series of ceiling panels at the MFA Boston and his 2 commemorations of World War I at Harvard's Widener Library. For whatever reason, or a combination of all of these reasons, personal loss, war, he never completed his final keynote central panel before his sudden death in London overnight on April 15th, 1925, of an apparent heart attack. Press on both sides of the Atlantic were deeply moved by Sargent's death. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of correspondence in the Boston Athenaeum scrapbook, belonging to architect and friend Thomas A. Fox, is this simple Western Union telegram sent that morning from the artist's sister, Emily, stating simply, "John died today." His death marked the end of his progress on the library work. A cast of the crucifixion sculpture on the south end, shown here in his memorial exhibition at the Royal Academy, marks his memorial in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. After memorial exhibitions at the Academy in London and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, study of the murals and, in fact, study of Sargent went comparatively quiet for decades. The library murals accumulated layers of dust, so bad, in fact, that a saw-whet owl, and this is a true story, a saw-whet owl found a nesting place in the hall and was only discovered by facilities staff when owl pellets started mysteriously appearing on the floor. It's better now. Some 60 years after his memorial exhibitions, a major exhibition of Sargent mounted in New York and Chicago, and a new biography was published. 1998 saw the launch of significant retrospective exhibitions between London, DC, and Boston, and the first volume of the complete works of Sargent, a mammoth project led by Richard Ormond, Sargent's great-nephew, and Elaine Kilmurray, which piqued fresh interest in Sargent scholarship. We are indebted to them for providing the long and thorough view on Sargent's career and his body of work. Sally Promy's was the first published book to explore the BPL murals specifically in depth, and her work was followed by a major conservation campaign by the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at Harvard, a project in which Gianfranco Pocobene and Kate Smith were deeply involved in 2003 to 2004. These accomplished conservators will be joining the series with a talk tomorrow evening, May 10th. We hope you'll join us. So now that we've taken a little spin through the murals, I want to spend the last portion of these remarks taking you down a few rabbit holes to talk about some ways in which we might cast new light upon Sargent's library work. Despite their depiction of the ancient history of religions, these murals made plenty of visual references to Sargent's time and followed his progression as an artist. There is still plenty to explore today. Sargent's art world. Conservators and art historians have noted that Sargent's style and approach to the murals changed considerably over the course of the subject, or the project, I should say. After all, it did span 29 years of his career, and he learned along the way. For one, Smith and Pocobene observed that his techniques for affixing raised relief evolved and improved. The sense of unity between his panels developed over time too. In 1916, Sargent created a bridge between the 1895 north end and 1903 south ends of the hall, with a unifying background color in these lunettes, a deep, almost oceanic blue. This is visible in the background of some of these samples shown here. The blue sets up an interesting opportunity. We've talked about Sargent's use of gilded relief to illuminate the figures, but here he's able to accomplish some visual sparkle with pure paint. We're going to take a mini dive into color theory. Let's get closer to some of the figures in the heaven panel. You might notice that Sargent has outlined the figures and elements in this panel with a russet orange. Conveniently, these two colors, blue and orange, sit on the opposite side of the color wheel and are known as complementary colors. The intersection of these complementary colors, orange and blue, green and red, purple and yellow, shown on your screen, read as a glow to the typical human eye. Looking at the intersection of these three pairs, you might make out that dividing line of vibrance. The late 19th century saw publications on color theory, detailing the sense of illumination from these color combinations. Painters in the movements of Impressionism and Pointillism, such as Sargent's friend and correspondent Claude Monet, started consciously experimenting with the use of complementary colors to create a sense of visual light or sparkle. Paintings by Monet and Paul Signac in the MFA's collection are included here as examples. Details pulled from each piece show this sparkling combination of blues and oranges specifically. This use of complementary color would be particularly useful in rendering figures at a distance. In a skylit hall with unreliable light, it is much better now. Zooming in on the gaps between the harp strings in heaven exposes Sargent's cross-hatching of orange against blue to suggest sparkle and movement. The stylization of the flames in the hell panel is also notable for its nod to another design movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. The flames around the monster appear more structured than wild, with clean edges and defined curls. Sargent's creative headspace was also in the molding around these murals, shown at upper left, so it's possible that the flames here are an extension of this ornamental language in paint. It's also possible, given their creation in the 19-teens, that they are making a nod to the Art Nouveau movement, a style which streamlined organic forms in nature and decorative arts that had emerged during the course of Sargent's BPL murals. It has been said that these murals quickly fell out of fashion, but visually, there was much to discover that was current, if not ahead of their time. Sargent's library. Let's turn our attention to another 1916 lunette on the east side of the gallery, The Fall of Gog and Magog. As mentioned, BPL has two preparatory studies for this panel in oil. The earlier study, the central figure falling towards the lower right on left, is a reverse orientation of the later study shown at right, which is more aligned with the final installation. In both of the two studies and the final, there is a consistent element, a bright light vortex of paint, a body in the heavens that is recognizable as a spiral nebula, a galaxy, shown to the right of the first sketch at left and to the left of the second sketch at right. For an artist exploring spiritual or any imagery, this must have been an enticing subject. While illustrations of spiral nebula had been published, or I should say spiral nebulae, had been published in the mid-19th century, astrophotography, the photography of stars, planets, and galaxies, enabled the imaging of spiral nebulae in 1880 to 1917, just in time for Sargent's mural work. Sargent was also likely inspired by images of Saturn, as he incorporated a dark blue and green rendering of the ring planet in the final version of this lunette at lower right. Boston Public Library's Rare Books and Manuscripts Department holds dozens of books that once belonged to Sargent. donated to the library by the artist sisters and Thomas A. Fox. In this collection, now searchable online in the newly scanned card catalog files, we find a wealth of potential references for the artist's murals. For one, his well-loved copy of Lockyer's Elementary Lessons in Astronomy. Note the dog-eared corners and a splodge of some ochre-toned paint on the back cover in this image at right. In this book, we find not only illustrations of Saturn that look quite familiar and quite similar to that realized in the mural, but also an illustration of a spiral nebula at right. On the last pages, Sargent has even drawn out some proportions, perhaps of relative distances between planets in graphite. This single book is just one example of where other connections between Sargent's reading and Sargent's painting might be found at BPL. Sargent's models. In 2020, an exhibition at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum celebrated the contributions that Thomas McKellar, a Black model pictured here, made to Sargent's work for his mural cycles at the MFA Boston. Sargent and McKellar allegedly met in 1916, when McKellar was working as an elevator attendant at the Hotel Vendôme during Sargent's stay. As Sargent had composed most of his 1916 panels in London and traveled to Boston later that year for the purpose of installing them, it first seemed as though the timeline didn't support McKellar finding a place amongst the triumph figures at the library. The BPL murals were written off as essentially a footnote in that story. However, in their essay following the 2003 mural conservation campaign, Gianfranco Pocobene and Kate Smith note that a figure was added to the panel of hell after its arrival at the library, as evidenced in this September 1916 photograph at top prior to its installation. They note that, as shown in this contemporary image at lower right, a figure was later painted, and in some cases added with raised relief, above the snout of hell. But before now, we had yet to try identifying the model in this figure. Where were Sargent's reference studies for this particular body? His head is thrown to the left, his muscular arms are cast back in despair as he is enveloped in flames. Reviewing a number of charcoal studies at the MFA and the Harvard Art Museums raises some curious similarities. Thanks to the work of the team at Harvard, many of Sargent's sketchbooks from the period around his murals have been digitized, and many links, potential and confirmed, have been made between Sargent's sketchbooks and his final paintings. A few studies in particular, two of which we know to be Thomas McKellar at left and top center, stand out for their similarities to the added figure in hell. Ganymede from the MFA at lower left could have been appropriated to create the similar view of McKellar's arms raised and head tilted left, as though falling or bearing an invisible weight. Reclining figure from Harvard at top center is intriguing when we imagine how the subject would have appeared if drawn from a different angle, from behind his head, if it were tilted to the other side. We know that this is McKellar, but the catalog entry identifies this as a mural study without a match. Perhaps another sketch from the same session, different angle, is out there. This sketch of a hand from Harvard at upper right doesn't indicate the model, but it could be a way of Sargent working out positioning between model and mural. There is a substantial collection of mural studies at Harvard and the MFA, but we know that more exist. Let's make this an appeal for finding a closer match, the smoking gun of sketches, and perhaps for finding some clarity as to who this is. Could this figure above the face of hell indeed be Thomas McKellar, previously unattached to the library project? There are other stories of mural models to be investigated. One model, who has been cited and who posed in nearly 60 figures for Abbey's murals on the second floor, is Antonio Corsi, who stood in for Hosea in the Prophets panel. Here we have a juxtaposition of Corsi, Hosea, and one of our accomplished BPL art and architecture tour guides, Tom Stolman, in a tiled image Tom put together during our first COVID lockdown. Tom, if you're watching, we salute you. A number of Sargent's preparatory sketches in charcoal contain Sargent's hand annotations noting the model's addresses. An incredible platform, Layers of London, helps us to trace these locations, many of which had changed due to restructuring or bombing in the Second World War. Let's explore two of these people and places. First, we have David Bongberg, a noted model for a figure or figures in Sargent's Israel and the Law panel, shown here in a detail at upper center. The sketch was featured in a Vos Gallery's exhibition catalog by Molly Crawford Volk, one of our upcoming speakers on May 16th. Bomberg resided in a particularly poor block of East London, from what Charles Booth's poverty map overlay indicates. The color blue was rated as poor or very poor. Bomberg became an accomplished artist in his own right, and it has been noted that Sargent helped to secure this young Jewish artist's art school education. Another model for Sargent's murals, Pasquale Tullio, lived on Little Orford Street in Chelsea, London, not far from Sargent. It's the area that's shown at the center of this map, just below the letters S and T, outlined in blue. We know that this street no longer exists, but it takes resources like Layers of London to help us not only locate it, but also discern that this model resided in a high poverty block, again, in blue. Yet in the murals, Tullio is the notable arm of law. Somehow, this use of models in his murals becomes all the more poignant when we consider that Sargent was, prior to his mural commissions, called upon to paint some of the most famous faces of the day. These mini explorations reinforce the fact that these arms and legs, chests and shoulders are not anonymous, but drawn from real people. What are their stories? To wrap up tonight's remarks, I would like us to consider the panel that remains unfinished. A large rectangular pane at the center of the east wall above the staircase. Sally Promy noted Sargent saying that this was to be the, quote, keynote of his great project. From his plans, we understand that the intended subject was Sermon on the Mount. But what do we know about Sargent's vision for this panel? BPL holds 3 preparatory studies for the work in question. 2 focus on a group of figures gathering around Christ in graphite, the front and back, or recto and verso, on a single leaf of paper. The other is in oil, showing an overall view of the east wall in Sargent Hall. In the absence of Sargent, there's no way to say what would have been. We cannot assume that sketches, studies, or writing are indicative of what never came to be. After all, artists change their minds. The east wall study in oil depicts versions of the 3 1916 lunettes at top that resemble those installed, whereas the sketches for Synagogue and Church flanking the central panel appear quite different from the final panels installed in 1919. This suggests that the oil study may have fallen in the date range of 1916 to 1919, after the lunettes were realized, but before the completion of Synagogue and Church. This reminds us that the preparatory study, however detailed, does not necessarily align with the final intentions. The oil study for the central panel, however, stands out in the company of Sargent's other murals. It is, in both format and treatment, a landscape. The figures, rendered loosely, appear to meld with the earth, their warm and sandy tones of their robes mingling with the russet hues of the rocky plateau. Sargent had traveled again to the Middle East in 1905 to document the people and landscape and architecture of this region, considered holy and so relevant to his Triumph of Religion murals. The trip gathered not only reference materials, but resulted in what would be his first exhibited landscape painting in oil, the Mountains of Moab, completed in 1905 and now in the collection of the Tate Britain in London. It's amazing to think that this accomplished and well-traveled artist had yet to show a landscape in a public gallery until this was shown at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1906. That's quite late in his career compared to what he was working on previously, especially given that throughout Sargent's life, he relished documenting the landscape around him. Ormond and Kilmurray note that Sargent's final panel would have almost certainly drawn from the multitude of scenes he documented on his trip to the Holy Land, a large collection of which are noted in their catalog. The Tate entry also notes that the BPL inspiration was probably the reason for this trip. But what of the Mountains of Moab painting specifically? When we look at that oil sketch and the final exhibited painting, the similarities are clear. From the composition of the distant mountainous outcrop, to the contrast between the structured foreground, one of figures on the left and one of rocks on the right, and those soft receding hazy hills. If, and we repeat again, if this was to be Sargent's direction to pursue a landscape for his final note, it offers a meaningful parallel to the progression of his career. As a child, landscape work pervaded his sketchbooks. We see a few early examples from Harvard's collection here. All the more amazing when you realize that these were completed by a 12 and 16-year-old, respectively. As a maturing artist, Sargent relished the opportunity to travel and capture his surrounds and paint. A scrapbook page from the Boston Athenaeum showing photographs of Sargent working on plein air or outdoors in Maine is pictured here. When he sought to pursue a higher form of art in public murals, public painting, he largely swore off portrait paintings that bogged him down. The murals led to travel, and the travel led to landscapes. Ormond and Kilmurray suggest that this was, quote, a declaration of intent. The portraitist turned landscapist. How interesting that this study of Sermon happens to look so similar to his first exhibited landscape. The studies for his keynote strip away the symbols and icons and tightly wound figures of his other murals to show an expanse, a portal facing eastward to the place in which so many of these stories had played out. Air and space at last. Maybe landscape was Sargent's own divine. This summer, we will be featuring the work of some artists who have provided their own interpretations of Sermon on the Mount and projecting them onto this blank panel. For now, this blank panel reminds us that there is still a story unwritten in this project. From the discourse around problematic or harmful public art to the exploration of the models that are hidden in these immortal figures, to what they may reveal about an artist who was literally throwing everything he had, and even that which he didn't know he had, into a singular piece to prove his worth. These murals are not a project to be overlooked, but one to engage with now and in the years to come. The 2022 story of these murals is just beginning. Thank you. And I'm happy to take a few questions. If anybody has thrown them in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. Thank you so much, Amanda. Okay. So we have one question from Aileen Kaplan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. As I switch my screen, sorry about that, guys. What are the sculptural elements made of? Sorry if you already answered in this and I missed it. You didn't miss it. I actually am remiss in not mentioning that more fully. That will be discussed in large part tomorrow night by Gianfranco and Kate, who are speaking specifically on conservation. But I can say, again, from their work, with credit due to them, they have discovered a range of different materials. We're looking at plaster, gilded lead, glass, metal, and even a corrugated metal that was known as Encrusta Walton, which was actually a corrugated metal that allowed for light to sort of land in the gilding and illuminate the figures. So there was really a broad range of raised relief used. And again, Sargent was throwing himself at this left, right, and center, really going outside of his comfort zone. Okay. Looking for any other questions. From Chris K. Did Sargent title the mural The Triumph of Religion, or did someone else? Chris, yes, that was Sargent's decision in title. In fact, he wrote up a description of the murals that enabled patrons and really the broader public to understand what his motives were in some of the early installation phases. So that description, I believe, was published after the third round of installations. And again, the constant reference is Triumph of Religion, and that is artist assigned. From Jerry here, how much flexibility did Sargent have in the choice of subjects for the various panels? Also, I've heard that the blank panel was to be the Last Supper. Is that true? That's a great question, Jerry. As I mentioned earlier on, the artists, for the most part, in both this commission and throughout the library, were given relatively free rein in their choice of subject. So if we look at Edwin Austin Abbey, whose murals we mentioned on the second floor, for instance, Abby was looking at the book delivery room and said, maybe I'll show some subjects from Shakespeare. it will be the Shakespeare room. And then he was permitted to change his mind when he decided to pursue the subject of Sir Galahad and his quest of the Holy Grail. So again, that was an artist's decision, and one that he and the architect and this sort of cohort of artists, among them Sargent, Augustus St. Gaudens, and certainly Charles Follen McKim, really thought would be appropriate for the purposes of a library. And Jerry, you also asked that the blank panel was to be the Last Supper. The blank panel, as far as we know, the intended title or subject was Sermon on the Mount. So a gathering of figures at center with Christ at center, Christ and the disciples. So I'm looking at David's question, a topical query. JSS extensively exhibits the prophets of Israel, not a particular interest of mine, but not the evangelicists of the Christian scriptures depicting instead angels opposite the prophets. Is there any evidence about the identity of the models of the prophets mentioned in the talk? I think I'm looking at this, and David, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you were asking specifically about the models for the prophets of Israel. As far as we can tell, those were rendered off of real people that Sargent encountered on his travels to North Africa and the Middle East, with the exception of that one that we showed with Tom, Antonio Corsi, who modeled for Hosea. And you were wondering about evidence of the identity of the models of the prophets, more largely. I would encourage you to look for the larger interpretation of the religious iconography, and particularly some of the figures that were chosen, to Sally Promi's work, which again does an absolutely incredible job of exploring the religious imagery in particular. And I also encourage you to come to the panel discussion that we'll be posting on the website within the coming weeks. We do have two scholars of the history of Judaism that will talk about his choice of major prophets versus minor prophets. So you might find that interesting. From Joan Dunfrey, why did he choose history of religion as his topic? The first painting of early religion is very crowded. Joan, if I'm understanding your second part correctly, I think you're implying that that first portion in the north end showing the pagan gods and the Israelites oppressed is crowded. You are completely right. It's chock-a-block of figures. It is arguably the most complex in terms of composition in the whole cycle. But to your first question, why did he choose history of religion as his topic? Open for interpretation. But from what we can tell, Sargent thought that this would be an appropriately grand topic. So his early thoughts for that space, and again, it's a vaulted room on the third floor of the Central Library. He first thought he might show subjects from Spanish literature, perhaps Don Quixote. And that didn't really seem to meet this need of showing something incredibly grand. The subject of triumph of religion would obviously allow him to cover a really, really broad scope of subjects, but also a really, really broad scope of imagery. So although Sargent, who identified as a Christian, was not heavily, I think, weighted towards the religious bend, if we could say, this choice of triumph of religion was really a choice in terms of what it offered up for visual study. And again, getting into the different vernaculars and styles of different regions and icons. I mean, I think when we talk about an artist palette, in terms of a subject palette, there was a lot to work with. Thank you for that question. Let's see, from Anonymous. What was the third floor of the library originally used for / built for? That's a great question, Anonymous. The third floor of the Central Library was really intended to be the special libraries floor, where special collections and their respective departments would reside. So this is everything from prints to drawings to the incredible music collection to rare books and manuscripts, and more. This was really the space for the non-circulating special collections, of which BPL has an absolutely world-class supply. It was also the home to one of the exhibition spaces for those collections, the Wigan Gallery, which is just off the south end of Sargent Hall. And the room off to the immediate west of the hall was originally the room that housed the music collection, again, one of our BPL special collections. And it later became known as the Treasures Room, and again was used as a space for both the study and display of some of those special collections materials. The third floor area is part of the scope that is being considered in the larger McKim master planning process. It is a portion of the library that wasn't addressed in the last major restoration effort on this building in the 1990s. So it's due for work, and currently it is closed to the public. And there's a lot of opportunity looking ahead to the future as to what it could be. I'm looking up from David your follow-up question, and I think this might be the penultimate question of the night. David was saying that the visible south end of Jerusalem might conflict the literary depiction of the locale of the Synagogue well to the north. That is also an interesting point. I have to admit, I am I'm better versed in the religious study or the visual study of these murals than the religious study. And again, I would encourage you to read Sally Promi's Painting Religion in Public, which will shed some light on that subject in particular if you want to take a deeper dive. Another, and maybe perhaps the last question, I'll see if I can access this. Was Sargent a religious person? As mentioned, Sargent was raised in the Christian tradition, but in terms of his, active practicing of religion, this was not something that I think informed his choice for the mural subjects. Again, I think the choice was largely born on the idea that the scope of religions, world religions, would allow for an incredible range of subjects to choose from. And I'll take one more question, Amanda, actually, if you don't mind jumping one in the chat. And if anybody has additional questions that I haven't been able to answer tonight, please feel free to send them along. We're always happy to help to point you to resources that might help you to answer these questions or encourage further study. Okay, so I will take a last question this evening from B. Houston. How are the murals currently illuminated? Is sunlight dangerous to them? This is a great question for our pair of amazing speakers tomorrow night, John Franco and Kate, but I can answer this question as well. The murals are currently illuminated by artificial light that's cast upward from torchiers. So you may have noticed when we were exploring the hall, there's a set of upright torchiers along the balustrade. Those actually have LED lights. We've recently reinstalled those that cast light upward into various components of the murals, as well as the skylights above. There is both natural light from those skylights and also additional artificial lights that keeps those light levels at a more consistent level than they would have been previously. The lighting rehaul was addressed as part of that Strauss Center restoration work in 2003, 2004. And again, I would point further questions to John Franco and Kate on that front. As far as the stability of the murals, we're not looking at the issue of fugitive pigments or pigments that can fade with exposure to light in the same way that we would with, say, works on paper from our print collection or from rare books and manuscripts. So oil paintings, for the most part, particularly oil paintings that have been mariflage and plastered onto the wall, are stable. So we don't have to worry about light levels when it comes to these panels in particular. So as I said, I'd be happy to answer any further questions that you may have. Feel free to get in touch, to reach out to us. We are here for you. We're here to provide resources, access to information and learning, and we're so grateful for your interest tonight. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I hope you'll be able to join us for the subsequent lectures in this series. It's a really exciting time. And again, I hope that this is the start of a new chapter in the study of Sargent at Boston Public Library. Thank you all.